You open your eyes. No alarm dragged you out of sleep. No meeting waiting on your calendar. No inbox filling up while you were unconscious. You just woke up because your body was done sleeping. You sit there for a moment and ask yourself the most natural question in the world. What do I want to do today? For almost the entire span of human existence, that wasn't a luxury question. That was just Tuesday morning. That was every morning for roughly 300,000 years, and the life that followed that question looked almost nothing like yours. Here's a number that should stop you cold: 90,000 hours. That's approximately how much of your life you will spend working. 1/3 of every waking hour you'll ever have handed over to employment. And the strange thing, the truly strange thing, is that for the overwhelming majority of human history, that concept didn't exist. No jobs, no wages, no performance reviews, no career ladder, no boss, nothing. So what were people actually doing with their days? That's what we're going to figure out today, and I promise you the answer is going to make you feel something complicated. Let's start with the hardest evidence we have, because this isn't speculation, this is documented. In 1963, an archaeologist named Richard Lee did something that quietly reshaped how we understand prehistoric human life. He went to Botswana and spent an extended period tracking the daily routines of the Jew/Hoansi people, one of the few remaining groups on Earth still living in a way that closely mirrors pre-agricultural existence. He wasn't studying ancient people directly. He was studying the closest living window we have into that world. What he found was startling. Adults in that community spent roughly 2.5 days per week acquiring food. That's it, about 17 hours total. The rest of the time was theirs to do with as they pleased. And before you dismiss that as one data point, understand that this same pattern shows up across every similar study ever conducted in completely unrelated parts of the world. The Hadza in Tanzania, the Ekirch in Paraguay, the Matu in Western Australia. Different continents, different climates, different languages, different everything. And yet the numbers are nearly identical every single time. Somewhere between 15 and 20 hours per week spent on survival-related activities. You probably work double that every single week. Now some people hear that and immediately push back. Those are modern people living in modern times, even if their lifestyle looks traditional. How do we know ancient humans 50,000 years ago lived the same way? The answer is buried in their bones. When archaeologists compare skeletal remains from ancient hunter-gatherers against the bones of early agricultural populations, the contrast is almost violent in how clear it is. Early farmers were shorter. Their skeletons show markers of nutritional deficiency. Their teeth were riddled with decay from carbohydrate-heavy grain diets. Their spines and joints show the unmistakable damage of repetitive physical labor performed year after year after year. And on average, they died younger. Hunter-gatherer skeletons tell the opposite story. Taller frames, denser bones, healthier teeth, less joint deterioration. These were not people grinding themselves down through endless toil. Their bones are the record of a life with more variety, more rest, and less accumulated physical damage than what came after them. The skeleton doesn't lie. It can't. But the most remarkable evidence, the evidence that truly gets under your skin, is something that shouldn't exist at all if ancient life was the brutal, desperate scramble for survival that we've been taught it was. Art. In 1994, a group of explorers discovered Chauvet cave in southern France. Painted on the walls inside were images created approximately 30,000 years ago. Horses, lions, woolly rhinoceroses, rendered with perspective, with shading, with a sense of movement so accurate that when modern artists first saw photographs of these paintings, several of them refused to believe the dates. These weren't primitive scratches. This was sophisticated, deliberate, skilled visual art. Creating them required planning, preparation, and most critically, significant amounts of uninterrupted time. Think about that for a second. Someone, 30,000 years ago, carried fire deep into the earth, found a wall they liked, and spent hours or possibly days painting animals on it. Not to eat, not to survive, to create something beautiful. In Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found shell beads estimated to be 100,000 years old. Tiny holes drilled carefully through seashells, clearly designed to be strung together as jewellery or ornamentation. Here's the detail that makes this extraordinary. The nearest coastline to that cave was 20 kilometres away. Somebody walked 40 kilometres round trip just to collect shells, then brought them home and spent additional hours carefully drilling holes through them with stone tools. For jewellery, to look good 100,000 years ago. and in 2008 researchers in Germany unearthed a flute carved from a vulture bone, dated to around 40,000 years ago. 5 finger holes spaced with enough precision that when modern musicians examined it, they confirmed it was capable of producing a recognizable musical scale. Whoever made that flute didn't just understand that hollow bones make sound. They understood pitch. They understood intervals. They crafted an instrument. These aren't curiosities. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, archaeological sites from the past 100,000 years are dense with evidence of this same pattern. Objects decorated with far more care than function required. Tools crafted with elegance that served no practical purpose beyond being beautiful. Items that clearly took hours of focused, skilled work with zero immediate survival benefit. This is what people did with their time. They made things, they decorated things. They created meaning from raw material. Not occasionally, constantly. So let's actually walk through what a day probably looked like. You wake up around dawn. The fire from the night before is still alive, barely. Someone feeds it. You eat from whatever was gathered or hunted a day or two ago. Maybe dried meat, maybe nuts, maybe fruit. Breakfast isn't a solitary experience squeezed between getting dressed and commuting. It's communal. People sit together. They talk. They figure out loosely, casually, what the day might hold. Mid-morning, maybe a small group heads out to hunt or gather. But here's something important to understand. They don't go every single day. If a successful hunt 2 days ago left food in good supply, there may be no particular reason to go anywhere today. Instead, you might spend the morning on something else entirely. Sharpening a spear point, working a piece of animal hide until it's soft enough to wear, weaving, carving, fixing something that broke. And this matters, because this isn't work in the sense we mean when we use that word now. There's no schedule attached to it, no deadline, no one measuring your output. You do it because being skilled at things earns you genuine respect in a small community, because competence is social currency, because the act of making something well is, in itself, one of the most deeply human things you can do. If the group does go hunting, the method itself is worth understanding, because it demolishes the image of frantic, dangerous chasing that popular culture tends to give us. Humans are persistence hunters. We don't outrun our prey, we outlast them. A small group will track an animal at a steady, sustainable jog, sometimes for hours, sometimes covering extraordinary distances. Here's the biological reason this works. Humans are among the very few species on Earth capable of sweating efficiently enough to regulate body temperature while running continuously. Most mammals can't do this. They overheat, and eventually the animal they're chasing simply collapses from heat exhaustion, and the hunt is over. It takes maybe 3 to 6 hours, including the walk back. Then the animal is brought home, butchered communally, and everyone eats. And then, by early afternoon, something happens that the modern mind genuinely struggles to make sense of. The day, for all practical purposes, is done. What fills the remaining hours is what I think sits at the absolute heart of this whole conversation. People rest. They sit in shade and have long, unrushed conversations. Adults play with children without checking their phones. They groom one another, not out of habit, but because the physical closeness of that act reinforces social bonds in ways that feel genuinely good. They make small decorative things. They nap without guilt. They watch the light change. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner spent years documenting the Jews/hoansi and recorded that adults in that community spend approximately 6 hours per day in what she simply called social time. Not working, not sleeping, just being present with other people, talking, laughing, teasing each other. And this isn't laziness. It's not unproductive time in any meaningful sense. In a world without legal contracts, without banks, without police forces, without any institutional safety net whatsoever, your survival depends entirely and literally on the quality of your relationships. If people in your group don't care about you, they don't have to share food when your hunt fails. They don't have to help when you're sick. They can simply decide you're not worth the trouble, so you invest heavily in being someone people genuinely want to be around. That investment comes in the form of time, attention, humor, generosity, and presence. Social time isn't separate from survival. It is survival. It's just survival that also happens to feel like living. Then the sun goes down, and this is where something almost magical happens, and I mean that in the most grounded, evidence-based way possible. Wiessner analysed hundreds of hours of recorded conversation from the Jew/hoansi and found a dramatic shift between day and night. During daylight hours, conversations were functional. Where were animal tracks spotted? Which plants were ripening where? There was a complaint about someone not sharing fairly last week. Practical things. But once darkness fell and people gathered around the fire, 81% of conversations became something entirely different. Stories, myths explaining how the world came to be, tales of ancestors who did impossible or heroic things, jokes built up across years of shared history, accounts of strange events from distant places that nobody present had witnessed. Wiessner's conclusion was that this is where human culture was actually assembled, piece by piece, night by night, over hundreds of thousands of years. The concepts of gods and spirits, the idea of a past that you can learn from and a future you can plan for, moral frameworks, collective identity, the understanding that you are part of something larger than your immediate physical experience. None of that is possible when you're hungry and exhausted. All of it becomes possible when you're warm and fed and sitting next to people you trust. There's one more piece of the daily picture worth mentioning, because it connects directly to something many people experience and feel vaguely ashamed of. Sleep research from the 1990s, along with historical records stretching back through medieval Europe, consistently confirms that before artificial lighting changed everything, humans did not sleep in one long, unbroken block, the way most of us attempt to now. They slept in 2 phases. First sleep lasted around 4 hours, then there was a quiet wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, darkness, stillness, a kind of reflective in-between state, then second sleep for another 4 hours. What did people do during that middle window? Historical accounts suggest prayer, reflection, quiet conversation, sometimes intimacy. It was treated as a natural, meaningful part of the rhythm of a day, not as a disorder to be corrected. If you've ever woken at 2 in the morning with your mind alive and felt like something was wrong with you, you might be experiencing exactly what you were designed to experience. Your biology didn't get the memo that we decided sleep should be continuous, so the full picture of a day looks roughly like this: 4 to 6 hours on food acquisition or tool making, 6 hours of genuine social connection, 8 hours of sleep in 2 phases, and the rest, sitting, reflecting, creating and wandering, simply existing without needing to justify that existence through output. That was the default human life for 99% of the time our species has been on this planet. Then, approximately 10,000 years ago, in the river valleys of the Middle East, something shifted. People began deliberately planting seeds and managing animals, and agriculture, for all the civilization it eventually enabled, was in many ways a trap that closed around the people who entered it before they fully understood what they were agreeing to. Here's how the trap works. Farming produces more calories per acre than foraging. More calories supports a larger population. A larger population needs more calories, which requires more farming. Within a few generations, the population had grown large enough that returning to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle became physically impossible. There were simply too many people to feed that way. The door had closed behind them, and farming demanded far more labor than anything that came before it. Preparing soil, planting, constant weeding, protecting crops from animals and from other groups of people who wanted those crops, harvesting, processing, storing, defending. The skeletal record of early agricultural communities tells the story plainly. These people worked harder, ate a less varied diet, suffered more from disease, and died younger than the people whose lifestyle they had replaced. But the population kept growing, and larger populations eventually produced specialists, potters, metalworkers, merchants, soldiers, priests, record keepers, and from record keepers, administrators, and from administrators, bureaucracies, and from bureaucracies, the entire architecture of organized society, taxation, employment, the idea that your time has an owner who isn't you. By the time we were building the first cities, the original shape of human life had been overwritten so completely that most people living inside those cities had no memory it had ever existed. And here we are. You spend 90,000 hours of your life working. Your ancestors, the ones whose biology you share completely, whose brains are identical to yours, spent roughly half that on anything effort-related. You fight to squeeze creativity into the margins of a schedule someone else designed. They made art because the afternoon was wide open, and art was a natural thing to do with wide open time. You experience a broken night of sleep and assume something is medically wrong. They built an entire reflective practice around that same interruption. You spend decades working toward a retirement that promises to give you back something close to what your ancestors had every single morning when they opened their eyes. The version of life you're straining toward, the one you promise yourself is coming once the mortgage is smaller, once the kids are older, once the promotion lands, once you finally have enough, that version of life, with time to think and rest and create and just be present with people you love, That was not the finish line for your ancestors. It was the starting point. We are not a different species from the people who painted Chauvet Cave or walked 40 kilometers for shells to make into jewelry. We are the same animal, living inside a system built so recently in evolutionary terms that our bodies and minds haven't had a single generation to adapt to it. We traded leisure for population scale. We traded freedom for food security. We traded time for the kind of civilization that could eventually produce medicine and the internet and the ability to understand our own history well enough to have this conversation. Whether that was a good trade is genuinely complicated, but the least we can do is understand that it was a trade, that the relentless, time-starved, productivity-obsessed way most of us live is not the natural human condition. It's a very recent experiment, and somewhere under all the noise of your schedule, the version of you that painted animals on cave walls by firelight is still in there, still wondering what you want to do today.